Professor Shah is the founder and the president of the Center for Civil Society, one of India's leading free market think tanks, and one of our regional strategic partners. Professor Shah has published extensively in international and Indian journals. He holds a PhD in economics from Auburn University. Without further ado, please welcome Professor Shah.
Thank you very much for giving this opportunity to speak to you in this important conference on freedom and prosperity. As you can see, I'm speaking from New Delhi, India, which is really, I think, past midnight here. So I'm trying my best to stay awake. And part of that effort is for me to stand up and speak to you so that I stay focused on what I want to communicate to you. As you can see in the title, what my co-author, Mr. Prasant Narang, and I have tried to do is to think about the various components of the Freedom Index and see whether we can learn some lessons for India. I think the American audience that you have probably is quite familiar with the term American exceptionalism. We have very similar sort of phrase in India, in the Indian exceptionalism when it comes to public policy. So most common argument that goes against any public policy reform suggestion is that India is very unique, and therefore any lesson that one can possibly learn from outside India is not really as applicable or relevant. Right? And so Prasant and I have been thinking about how can we analyze this data that we have in the two indices so that we are able to address the challenge of the Indian exceptionalism. And first thing we notice as we're debating this among us is that the rank for India for freedom on the Freedom Index is 87, while the rank for India on the Prosperity Index is 153. It's a pretty substantial difference in the ranking in the two indexes, right? And we also saw that this is one of the largest difference in the rank for almost any other country in the index. So what you see is that the relationship between freedom and prosperity probably is not as tight as it may seem, at least by looking at the ranking for India. And that also shows the Indian exceptionalism in some sense that many policy makers argue when we debate these issues in India. Right? Now, one thing that you would notice that the Prosperity Index includes 5 components. One, of course, is per capita income. Second is citizen happiness. Third is the health as measured by life expectancy. And those 3 are very common indicators of prosperity across many of these such indices that we use, whether it's the Freedom House Index or the Fraser Institute or the Wall Street Journal Index, right? But the other 2 components of the index, the environment quality and the rights of the minority, are rather unique to this particular prosperity index. And what you find is that those 2 components sort of make a huge difference in terms of the ranking on the Freedom Index versus the ranking on the Prosperity Index. Right? So in case of environment, I think as we so commonly understand, poorer countries usually do worse in environmental protection. As they become richer, obviously, there's a higher demand for environmental quality, and therefore countries begin to respond to that demand. Right? But as you are growing, you actually are worsening your environmental quality, right? And there's a sort of famous environmental Kuznets curve that shows the inverse relationship between environment quality and economic growth up to a point, right? Similarly, of course, minority rights are not related to income. They are pretty much orthogonal to income, are independent variable. And therefore, you can have a high income and the lower minority rights protection or vice versa. I think those are the 2 variables in the prosperity index that does support the sort of presumption that there is a not as tight a relationship between freedom index and the prosperity index, and something I think that requires a little more in-depth study, as we saw in some of the presentations earlier in the morning half. Right? So what Prashant and I came up with is to figure out what's the most common denominator across the countries in the index that we can take and apply that to India to draw some lessons for India. And so what we have done, which you will see in the slide that you have on the screen, so there's a score for India on the various components. Then we took an average of the global score. So all the 174 countries which are in the index, what's the average for 174 countries on that particular parameter, right? Then we did the average of the low middle income countries. So India falls into the low middle income countries as per the World Bank definition. So we looked at the number of countries which World Bank defines as the low middle income countries, LMICs, and we took an average of that. So what's the link between the average of LMIC countries vis-a-vis India, right? And the third thing we did is to take the regional average. So Indian subcontinent has a very shared history. So South Asian countries, which are 8 in number. So what's the average for those 8 countries? So basically what we did is took a global average of the low middle income countries, which are as per the World Bank, there are 54 countries which belong to that category, and the average of the South Asia regional countries, which are 8 in number as per the World Bank. And we thought if India's score is lower compared to all 3 of them, lower than the global average, lower than the average of the low middle income countries, and lower than the average of the regional countries, then that's an area which is the lowest hanging fruit. That's the most common denominator. And we should be able to draw some lessons for India, looking at that lowest hanging fruit in that sense. And so what you see is what we have done for the 3 different parts of the freedom index, the economic freedom, political freedom, and the legal freedom, and see whether we can look at the subcomponents of these freedoms and where do we draw the lessons for India. What's on your screen is that first one, economic freedom index score. There are sort of 4 components to that, and you can see the scores of India on all 4 of them. Now, if you compare the India score on economic freedom between 2006 and 2021, the years for which we have the data in the Atlantic Index, the score has dipped by about 1.08 points, right? While the regional score has declined by 0.17% points, and the global average actually has improved by 4.59 points. So India has not done as well in the economic freedom score. Now, which components of freedom score India has done worse? So we look at that. So you see the 4 components there in the table. One is property rights, and the freedom to trade, is investment freedom, and the women's economic freedom. Right? Those are the 4 components. India actually does very poorly compared to the other 3 averages, global, low middle income, and the regional average in freedom to trade. So India does most poorly in that area. As you can see, the red box there on the second column. Now, under the freedom to trade, which has also 4 sub-factors. One is tariff, rate of tariff, regulatory trade barriers, black market exchange rate, and the control of movement of capital and people. Right? So there are 4 subcomponents of the freedom to trade. And we look at those 4 subcomponents, it turns out that India does quite well in terms of regulatory trade barriers and the black market exchange rate, but does very poorly on the control of movement of capital and the people. Now, so that's, I think, one clear lesson that one can draw for where India can easily improve its sort of policy measures in that particular area of trade freedom, which is on the control of people and the capital. Right? Now, other area that India does very poorly is the women's economic freedom. And there, I think under that, there are, again, three sub-factors, which looks at the women economic freedom. One is the mobility. Second is the pay parity between men and the women in the equal job. And the last one is entrepreneurship and assets. Now, India does very poorly in one of the subcomponents. Well, it does quite well on the equal remuneration for work of equal value. So in terms of parity, India does quite well between men and women pay. Right? Where it falls rather behind is in terms of whether women are allowed to work at par with men in night shift, meaning working at night, either in the factory or in clubs and bars, or in dangerous jobs, or in industrial jobs. So in all of those three areas, night shift, industrial jobs, and the dangerous jobs, India has very different treatment for women. And therefore, India does very poorly on the score of women's economic freedom. Again, a very important area for India to sort of focus on in terms of improving the economic freedom of the women. If you move to the next slide. So I actually gave you much of the information which is on that slide on economic freedom. Maybe you can move one more. This is where I discuss the last part, which is about the women economic freedom that we just went through. The next component that I'm focusing on is political freedom. And as you would have expected, those of you know about India and India's history, India does fairly well on political freedom and has been, I think, done well throughout the time period of the index. Now, one area where the Indian score is somewhat lower than the regional score is in this political freedom. And it turns out quite sort of an historical accident that Nepal and Bhutan, the two of the neighboring countries of India, recently abandoned their monarchies and became democracies, or at least constitutional democracies. And that certainly has changed the political freedom score of the South Asia region substantially higher. And therefore, I think India does relatively worse in comparison to the regional average in political freedom. So among the many sub-factors of political freedom, the one sub-factor that India does, I think, most poorly compared to all the three sort of averages, global average, the low middle income country average, and the regional average, is in the government officials being sanctioned for misconduct. And so that is the issue of accountability of government officers. Of course, this includes office across the three branches of government, right? The political people, as well as the people in the bureaucracy and in the judiciary. And so on terms of accountability of the government officers, India does most poorly across all the three comparative in averages. So that's the, I think, brief lesson that one can see from the political freedom angle. And the last one that Prashant and I analyzed is the legal freedom, and see what lessons we can draw for India compared to the other three averages. So in case of legal freedom, again, India does relatively well in this overall legal freedom index. Over the last 15 years, India's sort of score has improved by 4.58 points. And this is in line with the regional legal improvement, which is 5.36. The global average, unfortunately, has improved only by 0.62. And the average for the low middle income countries has improved only by 0.54. Right? So compared to the low middle income countries and the global average, the regional average and the India's score is quite high. But if you look at the India score as an absolute number, which is 42.23, which is less than half on a scale of 1 to 100, is not really that great. And when you look at the subcomponents of the legal freedom, you also see where India is sort of falling behind. Right? So the subcomponents of the legal freedom are 5 of them. One is judicial effectiveness, the government integrity, state capacity, order and security, and regulatory effectiveness. Right? So among those 5 components, in the judicial effectiveness, India does not do as well. Now, judicial effectiveness also has 3 subcomponents: the efficient judiciary, civil justice, and criminal justice. Under civil justice, India fares very poorly on access and affordability, only 0.39 score, and from freedom from unreasonable delay in civil justice, right? So only 0.2 score for India. Under criminal justice, India fares also very poorly on effective criminal investigation system and also on timely and effective criminal adjudication system. So you can see, even though India does well compared to global and the regional average, in very specific areas, India, in the subcomponents, India does rather poorly. Right? So that's about the judicial effectiveness. In the subcomponent of the government integrity, India does very poorly on public disclosure. And the public disclosure has 2 sort of parts to it. One, whether the amount of assets and incomes are being disclosed by the government officers, and whether the sources of those amounts and incomes are also disclosed or not. So one is the value of the income, and second is the source of the income, and whether it's required by the political and the government participants to declare both of those values and sources. And India actually scores 0 on that account, while the global average is 13.77. So I think in terms of the accountability also of public officers in disclosing their income and sources of income, India does very poorly compared to all the 3 averages that I'm comparing with. Right. On the last sort of point of comparison on the legal freedom that Prashant and I looked at is order and security. India does also very poorly where people do not resort to violence, meaning people do use violence in terms of order and security, and also does very poorly on regulatory effectiveness. Right? And I think those are the 2 areas where India can do far better than what it does. So overall, I think 2 lessons to summarize what we have tried to do in this paper. And of course, many of the details would be there in the paper, which I'm not presenting in the short time period that we have. One, of course, is the tightness between the freedom score and the prosperity score. And as I pointed out, the quality of environment and the minority rights create this bit of dissonance between the 2 compared to other indices that look at the similar phenomena. And I think what we have done is to look at try to challenge the Indian exceptionalism when it comes to public policy advice and see what we can find as the lowest common denominator across the global average, the low middle income countries average, and the South Asia average, right? And see what lessons India can draw from that comparison. So that's is sort of our paper and the presentation for tonight. Thank you, everyone, for the time and attention.